Hi, this is just a review of how to set up your still life shot for rendering. Now, you've been building your models so far in separate files, and eventually you're going to have to bring them in together into one file. I'm just going to launch Maya here. Now, what you want to have is a single project that has all of your model files and your still life file. And there are two ways to bring the models into the still life scene. You can either reference them in or you can import them in. The benefit of using referencing is that it creates a link to the original file where the model lives, and it just brings it into the parent file, the still life file, when it opens up. So if you make changes to the child file where the models were built, then those changes will be updated in the still life file later on. Now, this can sometimes cause problems, or if you're moving from computer to computer, or at least from home to BMC, sometimes this can cause issues of the references not working exactly right. But it's a good flexible method and you should try it. So I'm just going to go over that now. So I've already set up a project here. I'm just going to go in here to set the project, and I've noticed that with my 2014 on the Mac at least, the set project thing doesn't always seem to work very well. However, let's just try. So in my Maya folder, I've set it inside the projects folder. And so I've already created a folder called Still Life Dryer, you can see here. And in the Maya folder, I've got a number of my model files. So I've got a helix, a pyramid, and a torus, and then I've got my still life file. But I'm just setting the project right now, so I want to go back here to the still life folder that contains all of these things in the workspace file. Choose, and then I want to open scene, and oh, miraculously it took me to the right spot. So I'm going to open up my still life scene, and you can see it's empty right now. But I want to bring in some files. So before I do that, let's just look at what the model files should be like before you reference them. So let me just go and open another scene, and I'll just open up the helix. So I've got just the model here in the middle of the world, no other stuff, any discarded things. I've named it. And what I haven't done yet is delete the history. But if I'm creating a reference object, I can always delete the history later and it will update. But for now, just to make it clean, I'm going to go in, edit, delete by type, history. I also have a material on here. As you can see, I've named that. And there's a file, or sorry, there's a checkerboard texture attached to the color attribute. Okay, so I'm just going to save this, and I will open the still life again. So now we want to bring these models in. Like I say, there are two ways. I can go to File and Import and choose the helix, and it brings it in. And you can see that it still has the texture on the surface, so it's brought in the object. And you can see that I didn't really show you the options for opening or importing an object or a Maya file, but it will append the name of the file. First it'll be helix, because that's the name of the file, colon helix, because that's the name of the object. So it does this in case you're importing objects that share the same name with other objects that already exist in this scene. It's called namespace, so it avoids problems that can happen if you have two objects brought in that share the same name. So that's importing, but now I've totally broken the link to the helix file, which still exists, but if I make changes to it and I want them to be reflected in here, I'd have to re-import. So I'm just going to delete this, and in fact I'll go into the Hypershade and I'll delete the shader, which is still here. When you delete the object, it doesn't automatically delete the shader. So we'll go in here and go to Edit, Delete Unused Nodes here in the Hypershade, and I'll get rid of that. Just going to save my scene. And now instead of importing, I'm going to go under File, Create Reference. can open up the options here, but we can just use them at the default. But you can see here, one of the things is namespace options, use namespaces. So it's going to give the name of the file and then the name of the object. So you can turn this off if you want to. You can see it says we strongly recommend to resolve name clashes. However, if you know you've named things appropriately, you can just do this. But remember, it's not just the models, but if you have materials or things that have the same names, that can cause problems. So to be safe, you can leave namespaces on. We're going to reference, and now I'll choose Helix. And it looks just the same. However, if we look at this in the outliner, for example, you can see here it says Helix, and there's a little sort of gem beside it. And it's got this other node here. This is the reference node. This gives information about where to get the file from. If we want to edit any of these things, let's say we can make changes here in the still life file, but they won't be felt backwards towards the model file. Only changes to the original model file will be felt in the still life file. So you don't really want to make changes to the shape of this thing here. You want to do that back in the model file. You can change the material though here if you want to. You know, if I decide at this point, well, I can change the material that's on it already. I can, you know, make it transparent if I want to, and you can. That won't be made. That won't go backwards, but these changes will be preserved here. I can even change the material entirely. I can put a Fong E on it. Again, changes will be felt here, but not back up the chain. But that's fine. Sometimes you want to bring the model in and maybe work on the shader here. Reason for doing that could be using subsurface scattering, where you have to test it in the lighting conditions within the render scene. So you can do that here. You don't have to go back to the original file. However, you may want to, you know, then send the new shader you made back to the original file. You can do that by going into the Hypershade, and if I created a new Blinn here that I wanted to take back into the original file, I can go to File, Export Selected Network, and it will save it as a standalone MA file that will just have this Blinn material in it, and then you can import that here in the Hypershade in the other file to bring that in. Okay, so that's how you bring in the reference, and you can, you know, move it around, do whatever you want, place it wherever you want to. Now in this scene file where we're going to do our rendering, you can build things here too if you want to. If you decide you need a backdrop, you don't have to go into another file, make it, then reference it in. You can just build something here, but it exists in this file alone. So one of the reasons for doing references in separate files is that if you have a big animation like your MRP where you use the same object over and over again in separate scenes, you want to make sure it's consistent from shot to shot to shot. So if it's always drawing on the same file from shot to shot, you know it's always going to be the same. So if we go here under File, Reference Editor, it will tell us what references we have in the scene here. It tells us where to find them. This is how Maya knows to find them. You can force it to reload if you've made some changes. There's a whole bunch of stuff in here, and we won't worry about all this right now. But you can unload the reference if you want to get rid of it. If we go here and try and delete the object, you can see it says cannot delete Helix as it has locked or read-only children. That's because it's a reference object. If I want to get rid of it, I can go to Reference, Unload Reference, and it's gone. Oh, I can't undo that, so I'll reference it in again. So I can create a new reference here. There, it's back. You can see that I still have the old one in here. I can turn this on and off. So now I've got two references from the same file in here. So you can see that unloading the reference doesn't actually get rid of it. It just turns it off. If we want to remove the reference, we can use remove reference here. And it's gone. And now you can see we're left with only one reference object. The other handy thing in here is under reference. Yes, here it is. Sorry. If you want to break the link, if references are causing you problems, but you've set up your scene with references, you can select this reference and say import objects from reference. So it will sever the link, but it will bring the object in to this file in this state. So that's very useful. Okay, so let's create a couple more references. I'll bring the pyramid in. Just move it out of the way. And create another reference and bring in the torus. So you can see I modeled these at different scales. So I can change these scales here, or I could go back into the original file and change their scales. Now, for this sort of one-off still life, it's probably easier just to make the changes like that here. These are just transformation changes. You're not changing the shape node. You're just changing the position, scale, and rotation. It seems like scale is changing the shape, but it's not. It's just considered a change to the transformation of the object. So let's say we set up our scene, and I have to move these things so they're not intersecting with each other, so they look like real-world objects. Let's say that's good. It's not, but let's say it is. And we want to render now. So one thing we don't have are lights. So you do want to set up your lights in this scene. So let's say I'm just going to create a directional light. Okay. And now you're probably going to be using image-based lighting and Final Gather and things like that. I'll direct you to the Digital Tutors video that describes this rather than describe it here, because that's the way I learned it, and it's an excellent tutorial about how to set up the image-based lighting to avoid the sort of patchy lighting from the Final Gather. But let's look at what we need to do now to render the shot. First of all, we have to create a new camera. We don't really want to render from our perspective camera. So instead we'll go to create camera, create a new camera, and we'll go to panels here and go to camera 1. I'm going to name this shot cam. So often you'll have more than one camera in a scene for different purposes. So now you can see here I'm trying to, lay out my shot by moving my camera around. Of course, we can't determine how the shot will be framed until we set up the resolution gate. So in this camera, we want to go to View, Camera Settings, and turn on Resolution Gate. You can see I'm at 960 by 540, so I'm at half HD. So we also want to make sure our settings are correct here in the render settings. We're going to render with Mental Ray, and we have to change the image size here. Now we have to say what camera we want to render from. We can change that to shot cam. Presets, you're going to be rendering at full HD 1080. So that's full HD 1920 by 1080. Everything else is good there. We're not going to worry about passes right now. We talked about it in class. You're free to experiment if you want, but I'm happy just to see a beauty shot with this, all the passes together. Features, there's nothing we really have to turn on here. Now quality. Right now we're using the new quality settings in Maya, unified sampling, and the quality is at 0.25. You can try different settings. Try it at 1. What this is going to do is change the how it anti-aliases the edges of objects in your scene. So if it's too low, you'll see sort of jagged edged objects. If you want to set it higher to get different values. You can change the sample here. You can leave it at the default Gauss. Sometimes you change it to Mitchell and set the filter size to 4 and 4. That gives sometimes a slightly sharper edged, crisper looking image. You can leave it at Gauss. It filters the edges a little bit more. Nothing else really to change here. Now indirect lighting. Again, you can find out about this in the Digital Tutors video, but remember you have to turn on Final Gather here if you want to render with Final Gather. Nothing else to change here. Now if we just go back to Common, there are a couple of different ways you can render this. You can render it through the batch render settings. So right now I would have to want to give the file a name, so I could call this Still Life. You can also right click here and you can see it'll insert the scene name for you. The scene is already called Still Life, so it would insert the name, render layer, camera, things like that. There's some preset naming strategies here. Image format, I would recommend using a TIFF or an uncompressed TIFF. And we're just rendering a single frame, so we can leave this alone. Close. And now if we want to render, there are two ways we can do it. Since we're just doing a single frame, you can just open up the render window with that camera selected and click on render here and make sure you're using Mental Ray. I should turn off Final Gather because it's not really going to do anything for me here. It's going to chug away and render. Complete the Final Gather pass shortly. I'm just going to escape out of this because mine takes too long. And then you can save this image as File, Save Image to your render folder. Save it as a TIFF, as I say, uncompressed TIFF. Or you can do a compressed TIFF in this case. The only reason to have uncompressed TIFFs in Maya is when you're using them as textures, because Mental Ray doesn't play nicely with uncompressed TIFFs. So we can save the image there. The other way you can render out your shot is to go to under the rendering menu set here, render, and go to batch render. And it's going to launch the batch renderer here. When you say a batch, it sounds like it's going to do multiple frames, but of course it won't in this case because we've set it to single frame in the render settings. You can see it's working away here. We can check in the Finder how it's doing. So it's still writing this. It's only 128 bytes. Back in Maya, if we open up the script editor here, it will tell us how far it's gotten along. We're at 40%. So you can see it's kind of chugging away through this because I left Final Gather on. But ultimately, it will finish, and it will, if your project was set up correctly, and we've gone over this a few times now, so you should be able to set your project so it goes to the correct place, which in our case is the renders folder here. We want to see the Still Life TIFF here. Okay, so that's done now. 428 kilobytes, small file. Now, it's rendered against black in this case, but you can see there's an alpha channel cut around it, so there's transparency where the black was. So when you're doing your Still Life, you have to decide what your background is going to be like. Like I said before, I want you to play around with this. You can put something in the backdrop, you can model a plane, or a lot of you are using sort of curved backdrops like we were doing our render test, and that's fine. You can build a little stand, or you can do whatever. You know, if you want to change just the background color in the camera, if I select the camera here, pressing this button in the corner, and open up the attribute editor, you can change the camera background color under environment. It's black here, you can change it to white or whatever color. But it would be better if you actually had an object behind them, or just a plane, something that can catch the shadows and things like that. So when you turn in your Still Life, I want to see your final rendered shot, of course. and you're composing it at 1920 by 1080, so HD format. But also give me your whole project as well. So I want to see how your references work if you're using references, and you don't have to. But if I were you, I would give it a shot to see how things work. So I need the still life folder that's going to include your textures, your renders, render data. This is created when I did the batch render. It had to make some maps for the final gather, and then you'll have all of your final models here. Now when you turn it in, you can get rid of your incremental saves, at least in the copy you turn in for me, but I want to see something like this. So anyway, as I say, this is something I want you to play around with lighting, with the shading and texturing, and what it's like to render a final image. And it will put you in a good place going forward to work on your MRP when you have to render a series of frames. And you got to compose your shots and work with lighting and things like that. But there's a lot of freedom here for you to show off the models that you've made and to demonstrate how you can work with lighting and show form in the way that you would do if you were drawing or painting something like this, using light and shadow, core shadow, cast shadow, regions of lighting on the object, and showing the relative position of one object to another, textures of the surface, the material of the object. Okay, so follow these simple instructions and you'll be done in no time. Thanks.